Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at something that could have some really huge repercussions on the world stage. You sent over some research about former President Trump and his involvement with that Hamas hostage situation, especially that Shalom Hamas ultimatum he delivered over social media of all places.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes this whole thing so fascinating. It's like you have this U.S. president who is known for, shall we say, unconventional tactics.
Hmm.
Then you have this militant group that a lot of countries have designated as a terrorist organization. And right in the middle of this international standoff, you have all these hostages.
Yeah, you're right. It does feel like we are in uncharted waters.
Yeah.
Because for a long time, the U.S. had this policy of not engaging with Hamas at all. But then all of a sudden, they initiate these direct talks with them, even sending this special envoy, Adam Bowler, to Doha to try and negotiate. That seems like a big departure from what they had been doing.
It is. It really makes you wonder what could have caused such a huge shift. I mean, was it all about getting those American hostages released, like that 21-year-old Eden Alexander? Or was there maybe something bigger going on? Like, did they decide that they needed to completely rethink how they were dealing with Hamas in the long run?
And then you've got Trump, who comes in and throws this very public ultimatum out there on social media. It's one thing to have those quiet backroom diplomacy talks going on, but then to just broadcast all these demands and threats for the whole world to see, especially when their hostages' lives on the line, it just seems wild.
And the fact that he used the phrase Shalom Hamas adds a whole other layer to it. Like, yeah, it's a Hebrew greeting that means peace. But in this context, it just seems so much more menacing. It almost sounds like a threat that the only way there's going to be peace is if Hamas does what he wants.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It does seem like it was a calculated move to try and put more pressure on Hamas. But do you think that this kind of public diplomacy could backfire? Like, could it actually make things worse and put the hostages in more danger?
That's the gamble they take when they do something like this. By putting it all out in the open like that, Trump might have actually backed himself into a corner. Like, what happens if Hamas doesn't do what he wants? Then he doesn't really have a lot of options except to follow through on those threats he was making. And that could mean a military response, which obviously carries a big risk of casualties. And not just Hamas fighters, but civilians in Gaza, too.
And it's important to remember that Hamas had been holding 59 hostages since those attacks back on October 7th. And Israeli intelligence believes that only 22 of them are actually still alive, which makes the situation even more urgent.
Right. And from what we've seen, it looks like the situation had kind of reached a standstill before Trump came out with his ultimatum. Because Hamas had already rejected several offers from the U.S., they even turned down a deal where they would have gotten a ceasefire extension in exchange for releasing half of the hostages. I think that really shows that they thought they had the upper hand and were hoping to get even more out of it.
So then you have Trump coming in with this message where he basically gives the people of Gaza this choice. Release the hostages and everything will be great, or face serious consequences. He even went so far as to tell the Hamas leadership that they should get out of Gaza while they still can.
That's a pretty loaded statement, don't you think? I mean, he's basically saying that if Hamas doesn't do what he says, there's going to be some kind of military action. It's almost like he's trying to scare them into giving in.
So on one hand, you have this U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, who's using these traditional diplomatic channels and trying to find a peaceful solution. But on the other hand, you have Trump out there making all these threats and pronouncements on social media. Doesn't it seem like it would just make things more confusing and potentially dangerous?
It does, and I think it really shows how difficult it can be to balance diplomacy with the use of force, because you could argue that those two things are actually working against each other. While Witkoff is trying to build some kind of trust and find something that they can both agree on, Trump's going out there making all these public statements that could just end up making Hamas less likely to compromise at all.
So what does all this mean? Did Trump's gamble actually pay off? Did they end up releasing the hostages?
Well, it's not quite that simple. It's not just a yes or no answer. I think we need to look a little more closely at what happened after Trump made his ultimatum if we really want to understand what kind of impact his actions had.
So it sounds like things were really starting to heat up. Was Trump really serious about using the military? Or was that ultimatum just a bluff?
I think there were a lot of people who thought Trump was the kind of guy who would actually use military force. I mean, he had ordered those airstrikes in Syria, and he authorized the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani when he was president, so it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. But I think there were also people who thought it was more of a tactic to try and get Hamas to make a deal.
It just seems like such a risky move, though, especially when you think about all the civilians who could get caught in the crossfire. Was there anyone who pushed back against this approach, like other countries or people within the U.S.?
Yeah, some world leaders and humanitarian groups were definitely worried about things escalating and what that would mean for the people living in Gaza. But the Trump administration kept saying that their main goal was getting those hostages back safe and sound, and that they would do whatever it took to make that happen.
So did it work? Did Hamas back down?
Not right away. They basically said that Trump was all talk and that they weren't going to give in. They said they would keep fighting against the Israeli occupation. But it's hard to know what was really going on behind the scenes. Maybe they were starting to feel the pressure and rethink their strategy.
What about the diplomatic efforts? Like with Steve Witkoff, did Trump's comments help or hurt those?
It's really hard to say for sure. Those kinds of negotiations usually happen in secret, so we might not know for years what was really said. But we do know that Witkoff kept working really hard behind the scenes. He talked to all sorts of different people and tried to find any way he could to get a deal done.
But you have to wonder, if you're Hamas and you see the U.S. president making these threats on social media at the same time that another U.S. official is trying to make peace with you, how do you know who to believe? How do you know who's actually in charge?
Right. It's like getting mixed signals. That can make it really hard to build any kind of trust or find common ground.
And we can't forget about the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict going on in the background.
Yeah, that definitely makes things more complicated. You can't really separate what was happening with the hostages from everything else that was going on between those two groups. It just adds more layers to an already complex situation.
So we have this tense diplomatic situation, a U.S. president who's using social media to make threats, and a bunch of people whose lives are on the line. What happens next?
Well, to really understand how everything played out, we need to look at how other countries and international organizations reacted to what was going on.
You mean like other countries trying to help resolve the situation?
Exactly. This wasn't just something between the U.S. and Hamas. It was a situation that could affect a lot of different countries. So other groups, especially those with influence in the region, felt like they needed to step in and try to find a solution.
Okay, so who are some of these key players, and what did they do?
Well, one of the most important ones was Egypt. They have a long history of trying to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and they were really actively trying to get those hostages released.
Okay, so Egypt was trying to help. Did they have any luck?
Well, it was really tough. Hamas wanted Israel to release a bunch of Palestinian prisoners, and they also wanted Israel to lift the blockade on Gaza. But Israel didn't want to give in to those demands because they didn't want to look like they were giving in to terrorism.
It sounds like neither side was willing to budge.
Yeah, it was a really difficult situation. And then you had Trump's ultimatum on top of everything else, which added even more pressure and made things even more tense.
So did anyone else get involved?
Yeah, quite a few European countries and the United Nations also spoke up. They said that everyone needed to stay calm and try to work things out peacefully. And the International Committee of the Red Cross was helping too, trying to make sure the hostages were okay and helping the different sides communicate with each other.
So it sounds like there's a lot going on behind the scenes to try and resolve the situation. But what about the hostages? What happened to them?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that every hostage's experience is different, and we can only really know so much based on the information we have.
Right, of course. But did any of them get released?
Yeah, after a lot of negotiating and pressure, Hamas finally agreed to release a few of the hostages, mostly women and children, as a kind of sign that they were willing to cooperate. It wasn't much, but it gave people some hope that maybe they could work out a bigger deal.
So not everyone was freed, but at least some of them got to go home. That must have been such a relief for their families.
Oh, definitely. But unfortunately, most of the hostages, including those American citizens, were still being held. The negotiations were still going on, but things were moving really slowly.
It's just so sad to think about all those families who were still waiting and hoping for their loved ones to come home.
It really is. And the situation was still so uncertain. There were still times when the violence would flare up again. Israel would launch airstrikes after Hamas fired rockets into their territory, and then Hamas would threaten to retaliate. It just seemed like it could explode at any moment.
So even though some of the hostages were released, the tension and the danger were still there.
Yeah, absolutely. And as time went on, the focus kind of shifted a little bit. It wasn't just about getting the hostages back anymore. It was also about all the bigger problems that were causing the conflict in the first place. Things like the blockade on Gaza, the status of Jerusalem, whether Palestinian refugees should have the right to return to their homes, and whether a two-state solution was even possible anymore.
Wow, those are some really complex and long-standing issues.
They really are. And there just aren't any easy solutions. But I think this whole hostage situation forced people to pay attention to those problems again, and it started a new conversation about what to do about them.
So even though this crisis was about a relatively small number of people, it really had a much bigger impact. It made people think about how the world deals with groups like Hamas, the role of social media in these kinds of conflicts, and the need to find better ways to solve the root causes of conflict in the Middle East.
I think that's a really good point. It shows us that even something that seems like an isolated incident can actually have a much wider effect and bring to light some really big problems that need to be addressed.
Well, we've covered a lot today. We talked about Trump's ultimatum, the efforts to get the hostages released, and the broader implications of this whole situation for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
What do you think is the most important thing we learned from all of this?
I think for me, it's that even these small events can have huge ripple effects,
Yeah.
and they can reveal much deeper problems that need to be addressed.
I agree. And I think it also shows how important it is to understand the history behind these conflicts, why the different groups are doing what they're doing, and what the potential consequences could be, especially when people's lives are at stake.
It's a good reminder that things are complicated out there in the world, and finding solutions to these kinds of conflicts takes a lot of careful thought and effort.
That's right. And as you continue learning about these issues, here's something to think about. Is it right to negotiate with groups that have been labeled as terrorists? Can you ever really separate humanitarian concerns from political ones? And what role should other countries play in trying to resolve these kinds of disputes?
Those are definitely some things to consider as we try to make sense of what's happening around the world.
It's all about getting different perspectives, questioning what you think you know, and always digging deeper.
I think that's why these deep dives are so interesting. Well, thanks for joining me today.
It was great to be here. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring.